Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
Welcome to the Carnegie Council. Today we have Mary Gentile speaking on giving voice to values in the workplace.
Business ethics courses present a menu of theoretical approaches. What if you took out the theory and taught practical workplace ethics? We now present Professor Mary Gentile.
Basically, I want to tell you the story of giving voice to values, or as I will refer to it, GVV. It is a new approach, and I believe innovative approach to thinking about, teaching about, and acting on our values and values-driven leadership in the workplace. But let me tell you where it came from, and I'm going to start by going back to my first introduction to business education, which was back in the mid-'80s. My first job at a business school was at the Harvard Business School, and I had come out of a doctorate in literature and film, so I felt like I had gone through the looking glass, when I ended up at Harvard Business School. And I remember in my first few weeks there, I sat in on the orientation for all the incoming MBA students. They'd bring the whole cohort of first-year MBA students into one room, and the dean would stand up in front of them, and he would say a number of things, but one of the things he would say is, look to the left of you, look to the right of you, and this is not unique to Harvard, these people are going to be your career network for the rest of your lives. And then he would pause dramatically. This is a resource, but also implicit in that is you don't want to irritate anybody too much, right? Because you're going to want to be able to call on them. So I thought that it was an interesting message to give at the very beginning of a 2-year educational experience. And I thought it set an interesting tone. I wasn't completely comfortable with it, but I thought it was interesting, and I could understand why he was doing it. But a few years later, I was invited to work with the core team of faculty who were designing Harvard Business School's first required curriculum around values and ethics. We decided we had an opportunity to do something a little bit different. We would stand up in the classroom and say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. These people will be your network for the rest of your lives of people that you can call on when you encounter ethical conflicts or values conflicts, and people who you've come out to, if you will, as someone who cares about doing the right thing, and folks who you can call on to say, help me figure out what the right thing to do is here, help me decide what's right. So we thought, well, that's an interesting step, and we thought it was a little bit, it was taking a step forward from that earlier story, but, certainly not sufficient. But we continued to work in the area, and I was at Harvard for 10 years. I left in the mid-'90s, and then I started consulting to other business schools around their curriculum in these areas. In the I guess it was around the late 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, I had what I call a crisis of faith. And I basically began to feel that maybe teaching business ethics was unethical. What was happening in the classroom discussions didn't necessarily feel to me that it was that constructive. I even was at a conference with a bunch of the leading business ethics faculty from around the country. And we were all doing a panel. After we'd all given our talks, we were doing a shared panel. And I remember that there was one of these guys, who I'd known for years, who was talking about how there'd recently been some studies that had showed that when they surveyed students before their courses and then after their courses in business ethics and in MBA's programs, that they were less ethical afterward. So I kind of stepped away from this for a little while, and I still was working with business educators around curriculum, but not specifically always ethics. But around that time, I got invited to do a consulting gig at Columbia Business School. My gig was looking at issues around environmental and social impacts, but they were also doing something around ethics at the same time that I was not. This project was not my idea, but they told me about it. And what they were doing is they were inviting all of their incoming MBA students, which at the time was about 600, to write a little essay as they matriculated. They were asked to think about a time when their values conflicted with what they were asked to do in the workplace, and then to say what they did. Not necessarily that they voiced their values or they didn't, just what did you do? And they all wrote these little essays, and They were anonymous if they wanted, and it's not scientific, it was self-reporting. But because I was there, they let me read these essays over several years. So I read, well over 1,000 of these essays, and they were really interesting. And I had like my aha moment, because basically what we saw was, okay, first of all, you could count on one hand the number of folks who didn't have a story to tell. They all had been asked or told to do something that they thought was wrong at some time in their careers. And think about it. These are people who've been out in the workplace for 4, 5, 6 years already. Secondly, if you think about who goes to a school like Columbia, certain industries are more heavily represented than others. And so they started to have similar scenarios that got real repetitious very fast. There were a lot of people from the financial industry, financial services area, a lot of people from the big management consulting firms, McKinsey's, et cetera. There were a good number of people from the big pharmaceutical firms, some from high tech. And so the kinds of scenarios we saw were things like I was told to inflate or deflate my billable hours in a way that didn't really represent what I was doing in order to either to match what we had projected or to maximize revenue. Or I was told to puff up the capabilities of a new product, maybe a new drug or a new piece of software, beyond what the data actually substantiated it could do. And there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues around hiring, firing, discrimination, things of that nature. So the scenarios got repetitious, but the responses differed, and the responses fell into 4 buckets, recognizable buckets. The first bucket, the largest bucket, were people who said, yes, I encountered this kind of a conflict, and it really bothered me. Didn't just roll off my back, but I didn't really think I had any option. So I just sucked it up and I did what they told me to do. I thought it was wrong, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. That was the largest group, a little less than half. Then there was a small group who said, yes, I encountered this kind of conflict. It really bothered me. It bothered me so much I couldn't do it. But I also couldn't think of anything else to do, so I removed myself from the situation. So some of these people quit. Some of these people got themselves transferred to another work group, but that was a very small group. Of a third of the people are saying, yes, I encountered this, it bothered me, and I tried to do something. And a small group of those said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So what we started to do was to slice and dice the data, to look at the scenarios, to kind of say, well, they're at the same organizations, they're in the same kinds of positions, they're having the same kinds of conflicts, and yet some of them think there's something they can do and do it effectively, and many of them think there's nothing they can do, and they either give in or leave. So we thought, what's different about these groups? So we started going back and forth. And it didn't seem, from reading their scenarios, and again, not scientific, but provocative, it didn't seem that one group was more morally troubled than the other group. It didn't seem to be about good and bad people, basically, because they'd all identified this as something that bugged them, It didn't seem that one group was more sophisticated or organizationally savvy than the other group. Some of the folks who found ways to voice and act on their values were very, very clever and came up with these amazing win-wins, But some of them were really clumsy and even naive in the way they did it. In the end, the only thing that we could identify was that the folks who were able to voice and act on their values effectively at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it may have started out talking to a spouse or a partner or a friend, but eventually it found its way into the organization and it changed the trajectory of things. Well, I thought at that point, there's nothing I can really do with that. But then I actually remembered something. I remembered some research I had seen years earlier when I was still at Harvard, and it was some research on moral courage and altruism. And the guys who did this research, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, had decided to interview people who had acted on their values in times of great stress, great duress. So they talked to people who were rescuers during World War II, people who had risked their lives to save others who were at risk from the Holocaust. And they interviewed them in depth, and they tried to figure out, do they have any characteristics in common? And, as is the way in that research, you find a list, right? And one of them stayed with me. At the time, it resonated with me, and it stayed with me since. And it was that the people who said that they'd found ways to act on their values had, at an earlier point in their lives, when they were young adults, with someone they respected, a senior person, a parent, a teacher, a boss, a mentor. They had had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various kinds of moral conflicts. They had literally pre-scripted themselves. In other words, they'd come up with words to say, and they had said them out loud. They had voiced the intent, okay? So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You know, it's a kind of rehearsal, this pre-scripting. So I started looking around. I started doing interviews with business people and with some of the people who had reported voicing their values in these Columbia essays. I also started looking at a lot of the research. And I found that increasingly there was a lot of research from many different disciplines, from social psychology and from in the area of decision-making biases and heuristics and problem framing, anthropology, that was suggesting that rehearsal matters. That basically the what you voice, what you say, what you do, what you practice becomes a kind of default behavior. So I thought, if rehearsal is important, what is it that we're teaching in business schools? And then I really got depressed because what we were typically doing in business education and in a lot of corporations is two things. We would teach awareness and analysis. Awareness being, we're going to introduce a lot of case studies so you can see the kinds of values conflicts you might encounter, so you'll recognize them when you encounter them. We also would teach analysis, which was teaching you to discipline your thinking. We'll teach you philosophy, we'll teach you utilitarianism and deontology and virtue-based ethics, and so then you'll be able to reason through to figure out what the right thing to do is, which also is a very good thing to do. I'm not saying you shouldn't do these things, but it's limited. And I think the best limitation is illustrated by a story. I interviewed a CEO in the course of doing all this work, and he told me that whenever he hired an MBA, he would bring them in and talk to them just before he made the offer. And he said he'd recently been interviewing an MBA from one of the top business schools. And he said to him, he was talking about his education, he said, "Did you take a business ethics class?" And the guy said, "Well, yes, it was required." And so the CEO said, "Well, what did you learn?" And he said, "Well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue-based ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you figure out what you want to do, and then you select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do." So obviously, he was yanking my chain. I was the ethics lady. But, you know, there's a certain bit of truth to that. These models are not meant to tell you what is right. They're enabled to help you think clearly. They, by definition, conflict with each other. And they certainly don't tell you what to do, how to get it done once you've figured out what was right. So again, awareness and analysis are important, but what ends up being rehearsed in class are all these different, what one professor called the professional rationalizations. All the kinds of excuses that we all have, some of which are true, about why maybe we can't really do this after all. We kind of have this model. What happens is you're working along, you're doing your work, and then something comes up, you kind of get this feeling in your gut that something's wrong, it's probably not right. But before you even think about how you could do anything about it, you're aware it's going to be impossible. It's going to be so hard. And so all of these preemptive rationalizations rush in. You know, well, maybe I don't have all the information. Maybe the market's already discounted for this. Everybody already knows this is happening. This is just the way the industry works. Even if it is wrong, it's not my responsibility. Maybe I'll make it worse. All of those kinds of things, many of which may be true, as I say. But what happens is, because those all rush in, we never even get to the point of thinking about what might be possible. And in the course of my interviewing people and reading all those stories, you know, we actually found out that some things were possible. And so what we've decided is, what Giving Voice to Values is to create an educational opportunity, a discussion opportunity, or as an individual, a thinking opportunity, where you separate that moment when you get that feeling in your gut that something's wrong, and the moment when all the preemptive rationalizations rush in, that you basically just stretch that out a bit. And in that space there, that safe space, you just say, what if? What if I actually thought this was wrong and wanted to find a way to do something different? We're not asking you to commit. We're simply saying, what if you thought this was wrong? How could you get it done? So now the way you show you're smart and sophisticated is to come up with a way of doing the thing that everyone says it's impossible to do. So at heart, that's all it is. We're just asking a different question. Instead of asking what is right, we're asking, once you know what you think is right, how do you get it done? Everything was built on top of that simple idea. What we learned from interviewing people who've done this is that, well, I'll say it in the reverse. I went into this thinking that in order to voice your values, you had to be brave. You had to be probably kind of extroverted, maybe someone who doesn't mind confrontation and arguments, maybe someone who enjoys taking risks. And sure enough, I found, and therefore I thought I was going to go to hell because I was none of those things, right? But when I interviewed people, sure enough, I found people who saw themselves that way. And when I asked them, why were you able to act on your values? I remember talking to this real estate development guy who had stood up to a corrupt contractor. And he said, I've always been kind of a risk taker. I thought, why the heck not take a risk in the service of something that matters to me? You know, so it was very much what I expected to hear. He didn't mind getting into a fight with this contractor. But there were other people I talked to when I asked who said, one woman I remember said, well, I've always been a kind of fearful person, and this seemed like the safer route. And so what I started to realize is that if you know who you are, you can frame the values conflict in a way that plays to your strengths. So instead of preaching to the person who liked to take risks that he needed to be more conservative, or preaching to the person who was a very conservative and fearful person that you need to be bold, those things were not going to work. But instead what we suggested is you can actually reframe your challenge in a way that plays to who you are, plays to your strengths. And then we developed case examples of people who'd done that. So we had cases of people who had sort of stood up and been leaderly in a kind of extroverted way. And then we had people who had taken a leadership role by asking a question, you know? So we tried to show people that there were many different ways to do this. So we started developing all this material. We have hundreds of pages of material. We made it available for free online to educators. It's free because our goal was not to create a product, but to create an idea. And it wasn't just to create an idea, it was to seed an idea. It was to to generate an idea and then distribute it so that we could transform management education.
The idea is that people could actually come up with actions around their own solutions or somebody else's solutions, if not their own, if they're practicing. But the underlying assumption is that there actually are solutions. But what if there aren't? I mean, the toughest ethical dilemmas don't have solutions.
So that is the key question, and that is in fact at the heart of giving voice to values, is that we flipped that question. Because traditionally in business education, and even in a lot of corporate education, what we would always hear from people is that the black and white issues are the easy ones. It's the gray issues, the ones where it's not really clear there is a solution. That's where it's really tricky. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's what we really need to focus on in ethics education. And so what would happen is that faculty like myself would spend a lot of time creating these elaborate and pretty much by definition impossible case scenarios and share them with the students. And I can remember one of my friends at Harvard telling me that after about the first 2 weeks in the class, the students were all suffering from what he called ethics fatigue because they would spend hours in endless debate about questions that literally did not have a right answer. It's the example I gave about utilitarianism and deontology. By definition, they conflict. One is cost-benefit analysis, the other is duty-based, and by definition, there are times when they're going to conflict. Not always, but often. So it's not that those are not real and important issues. They very clearly are. But the fact is, those are the issues where intelligent people of goodwill could reasonably and legitimately disagree. Okay? Just because I think one thing doesn't necessarily, and you think something else, doesn't necessarily mean one of us is evil or is immoral. There actually are hard. It's hard to weigh some of those things. But there are other cases that, in fact, are much clearer, that most people, maybe not everyone, but that most people would agree this is actually over the line. Sometimes it's just out and out illegality, but not always. And those are the cases where we never talk about those, and those are the ones that I was saying earlier are often the ones that end up on the front pages of the paper, where people literally have broken the law or lied. And what has made them difficult is that it's been difficult to figure out a way to get them done within an organizational context where all the pressures are to go in this direction, even if you know it's against the law, but you think you'll never get caught, so therefore, or something like that. So what we decided is, let's flip it. Let's teach people the skills to be able to voice and act on their values in these cases where most of us would agree. And they'll become skillful at that. And hopefully we'll be able to address a lot of those issues that made it to the front pages. But along the way, what you're also learning is how to talk more effectively and more persuasively and more constructively about all those issues that are insoluble.
Going through my little examples of, I mean, mostly times when I didn't say something or felt that I couldn't say something.
Yeah.
It was, oh, I've only been here less than 6 months. How
Yes.
can I do it? Or oh, the person who, is doing whatever runs contrary to my values is so super senior to me. How could I do this? And I want to know, even, I guess this is almost the pre-how, how do you get at getting beyond those barriers to get to the how I'm going to approach this?
Yeah, and actually those are exactly how issues. I mean, those are right on target, and I'm so glad you asked them. And there's different ways that we've tried to address those things. So the first thing, you talked about two different things. One was that you were more junior in the organization, you were newer. One of the things we learned on that level issue, senior versus junior, is that when we talked to people who were very junior in an organization or very new in an organization, they would say, well, I don't have any authority, I haven't built up relationships here yet. If I were more senior, if I was a CEO, I can set policy, I could do these things. But right now it's too risky for someone at my level in the organization or my short tenure. And then we would talk to people very senior, CEOs and C-suite people, and they would say, I have a lot of people depending on me. I would like to act on my values, but I know that the impact of my doing so there's a lot of pressures on me. It's very risky for me to take this. If I were more junior in the organization, I would have less at stake, and I could do this. So we were kind of hearing, and then we'd talk to people in the middle, and they'd say, I'm getting squeezed from both sides. So what we learned is that those were all true. All of those reasons were true, right? But we nevertheless found people at every level who found ways to do it. And so what we started to realize is that you have different degrees of freedom, you have different constraints, and you have different levers you can pull depending on where you are in the organization. There's always something you can do, but it's going to be very different. And so we tried to intentionally create case examples at every level. So we have the CFO who's able to make a policy decision to address issues. But we also have the undergraduate or the recent graduate from an undergraduate accounting program who is working for an organization that's fudging their numbers, who is addressing it in a very different way. The way he addressed it was by presenting himself as a learner and by asking questions that no one else was asking. And so what we found is that there's always something you can do. The other thing we found is that it's rarely, if ever, standing up and giving an impassioned little speech, okay? That tends not to work. The people that we found who did this effectively found ways to understand what was at stake for everyone involved, not because it was going to change their reaction, like, oh, now I know what's at stake for you, and so I'm going to change, but more because they understood that maybe they could come up with an argument that would be more persuasive because they understood what the need was. And also, people have to understand that they're not necessarily going to resolve it in one conversation. A lot of times people had to actually think about something that was much more incremental.
There is another case, which is that you work for an organization, you don't go through a case with conflicting values personally, but you know that the organization, or it comes up in media that your organization is deeply involved in something illegal, something unethical. And you don't feel well, you don't feel good about it. Mm-hmm. Although in your personal tasks, you have never faced that situation or that chance. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's another department or other things you don't handle personally, so you are not personally involved, but you still feel very bad, and sometimes you you think of your role, perhaps you want to give up, to resign, or how can you reframe that? How can you first of all, I wanted to ask if you have ever seen people in that scenario, and
I've been in that scenario.
yourself.
I think most of us have, right? Yeah, no, that's a very, very common scenario, and I think it's a really important one. It's kind of akin to what people often call bystander issues, where it's not really that you've been told to do something that you think is wrong, but your organization is doing that, or you're aware of it, or those kinds of questions. And yes, that's very important, and we have talked to people about that. Those usually tend to be the kinds of scenarios where, again, it's not an intervention, it's a set of conversations. So the people that we've talked to who have been engaged who really feel strongly about something like that, what they've started to do is actually talk to a number of other people, gather examples from what's happening in other industries. Often those are the kinds of issues that require a systemic solution, because often they have to do with something that is common in an industry, and so they may need to create something that is more of a coalition for doing this. But yes, that's a really key issue, and it's not off topic at all. In fact, it's what we do talk about in some of our cases. So, listen, I know we have to wrap up. If you want to learn more about the curriculum, it's givingvoicetovalues.org, and you can download it all for free. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope this program was informative and provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.